Okay, in the first part of the video we explored how to glue the two sides of your yo-yo together. So you should now have, within your group, everybody should have 2 layers of acrylic that are glued together. And again, as we previously explored, these now need to be put on a centre lathe and have the edges skimmed so that they're ready to be polished. We're going to be using a piece of 4mm dowel again through the centre to ensure that your entire group's work all stays in one place. And if you look at this example here, you'll notice that several layers of acrylic have been fixed together on the dowel. And we've temporarily fixed these together in batches of 2 with a piece of double-sided tape. Let's just look at how we did that. So we take our 2 layers that have been permanently glued together, okay, fix it on the dowel. We take our next piece and you'll notice there's a piece of double-sided tape, a small square of double-sided tape on that piece. If you remove the backing, and then you can push that onto our dowel and that will then fix it together. This will stop them spinning as we try to cut them on our centre lathe. Now that's ready to be put on the lathe. So let's take that over and look at how we do that. Incidentally, the wooden plate that you can see now in the camera stops the last piece of acrylic being scratched on the chuck of the centre lathe, and we'll look at what that is when we get the piece of material over there. Okay? Right, so this is the centre lathe. It looks much more complicated than it actually is, and it's a very simple machine to use. We have simple component parts. On this end, this thing here is called a tailstock. In the end of the tailstock, we have the centre. This is a live centre, which means it's actually able to spin as the machine revolves. You've then got this part here, which is known as the tool post, and in there you have a round-ended cutter. This part here is the part that spins and is known as the chuck, and that's then mounted in this part here that's known as the headstock. Okay, so if we fix our piece of acrylic in now, you'll see how that slides in. The piece of dowel feeds into the chuck and is left loose at the moment, not totally loose, but is left slightly loose. Okay, we'll just tighten that up a little bit just so that holds in place. That's it. Okay, and you'll notice that we used for that the chuck key that has a square head that locates in that hole there. Okay, we're now going to bring in the tailstock, which has that point on it, and that point is going to locate perfectly against our wooden dowel. Okay, you might need to adjust that slightly, and it must locate on top of that wooden dowel. So if we just pull that back a little bit, that's it now, and then bring that in so it locates on the wooden dowel. We can lock that in position with the lever on the side here. If you pull that upwards, it fixes now that tailstock in position, so that's not going to move. You can then turn the handle on the end. As you turn that handle on the end, it pushes that tailstock into the end of the acrylic, pushes that wooden dowel into this chuck and forces that whole sandwich of material up against the chuck. Now you can see just about there the wooden packing block that we put in, and you can see hopefully why we put that in, because the revolving part of the chuck would scratch that edge of acrylic otherwise. You're now ready to put the chuck key in and tighten up your dowel, and that whole piece is now fixed very tightly in position. Okay, it's very important obviously to wear eye protection before you turn the machine on, and on this machine it's fixed with a chuck guard, and the machine actually won't work unless the guard is down. Okay, so I'm going to come around the side so that we can see what happens when the machine is turned on. The cutting tool that I mentioned earlier is controlled with the lever on the outside edge. So you're going to move that by turning it, and as you turn it, it brings the cutter nice and tight up against your work. Okay, and you can see that actually coming in close to your work here. Right, now that's the bit that you're going to be controlling as you remove the material, as you skim the material. Okay, and we're going to turn the machine on and then we'll look at what that looks like when you take it off. Before you turn the machine on, you need to make sure, by the way, that the cutter isn't touching the acrylic. Okay, so there needs to be a little bit of space in between it. Right, so when we turn the machine on, you'll notice that the acrylic starts spinning round, but the cutter stays stationary. This is so the acrylic will turn onto our cutting edge and start removing material. It's important to take off a tiny little bit at a time and to move that cutter then along the length of your batch of material, all the way along. You can see the waste coming off on the end of the cutter. When you get onto the far side, you can then move the cutter further in and come back along that to remove even more. So we're at the end now. Care needs to be taken. Once you've got to the end of that, you must stop because you can run the cutter into the revolving chuck, the metal chuck. Okay, so we've brought the cutter in closer against the material and we're now coming back up towards the tailstock and removing a little bit more. You can see the swarf, which is what the waste material is known as, coming off on the cutter. You need to try to keep the cutter turning nice and evenly, and it's advisable, rather than holding the actual handle on the wheel, to almost hold the edges of the wheel and turn it like a steering wheel and ease it round nice and steadily along. The smoother you turn that along, the cutter along the material, the smoother your edge will be. So we've got to the end again, and we've moved the cutter slightly closer in, and we're going to now go back again. When the waste starts coming off in quite long strips like that, you can tell that you've started to cut all the way around the circle. When it's coming off in small chips, you're only touching parts of the circle. But as soon as the waste starts coming off in long strips or streamers, that means that the cutter is actually cutting all the way around. Okay? At that point, once you've got right to the end of your stack, it's worth stopping the material to examine whether you need to take off any more. There's no point taking off too much because you'll end up with something that's far too small. You can't put the material back on once you've cut it off. Okay, so we've got to the end there now, so we can stop that machine and we can lift up the chuck guard, and now we can take a look at the edge of the material. Okay, so has that cut all the way around? If you turn the chuck over by hand, you can then examine the edge all the way around to see that you have in fact cut all the way around. If it has been cut all the way around and you're happy with the edge, then it's ready to take off and it can be wet and dried.